Remind America of the fierce urgency of now.
If you're uncomfortable, like a lot of us are, it's time to talk.
It's time to talk.
It's time to talk.
It's time to talk.
One of the things that you just teed up that I heard you mention was systemic racism. And that's something that's being talked about so much these days. I feel like we have these little flashpoints that happen, right? Every time there's an issue with a Black person being killed as a result of a police interaction, right? It flares up, but then it goes back down. And I think that this summer, we really hit that flashpoint with George Floyd. And so I'm at least more aware than perhaps I was, maybe because I'm receiving it better and more tuned into it, but I'm beginning to understand more and hear more about systemic racism. The fact that it's embedded in society and we don't even see it, how it's impacted the housing market and schools and redlining of districts and mortgages. And it's been really eye-opening for me. And I know that, Thavius, you've got some perspective on systemic racism. So I'd love to have you kick us off and share your perspective on it, and maybe share an example of where in your world you see systemic racism.
Yeah. I mean, I think, at the heart of it, if you're going to talk about systemic or institutionalized racism, it's important to establish, like, what is the system we're talking about, right? What's the institution within, like, the confines of this stuff is happening, right? So we're talking about the institution of the government, right? Ultimately, like, what governs the society, what dictates how people within the American borders live their day-to-day life. So if we're going to go back and, like, look at, the establishment of the United States of America and the Constitution and the people who actually formed that, they were doing that for people who owned land, right? For people who had money and owned land. It wasn't about protecting the slaves, right? There were no Black landowners really at that time. There were no Black people who were afforded any sort of power. There were no women who were really in positions of power. It was about white men protecting landowners who were other white men, right? So from there, everything that's happened from that point forward to try to give rights to people who are not white men has been about trying to break the system, right? Do things to, like, improve the system for those who aren't benefiting from those who weren't considered when the system was first, created and set up. So it seems crazy for me to anyone to think that institutionalized racism doesn't exist. Like, how could you possibly even argue that? Like, the country was founded by people who came and stole the land from people who were already here. And at the time that the document was written, they were in the process of trying to further complete the genocide of the Native Americans who were already on the land, right? With messed up treaties that got broken repeatedly. And those people who were talking about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness were slave owners. So everything that started this institution that we currently live in is a result of that. So it's inherently racist at the heart of it. It's racist, it's classist, there's misogyny, there's gender issues, there's, it's the whole system is there to support wealthy white men, right, that own land. That's the whole premise of the Constitution of the United States. So, like, has all that been eradicated? Has all the issues that, like, initially were a problem in the Constitution, is everyone properly represented now? Do we all have equal rights? Clearly not, right? So, like, I could talk about specific instances where there's institutional racism based on, people being forced to live in less than desirable housing. The whole idea of the term ghetto and people being called ghetto because they live in what are called ghettos, right, in the U.S., in housing projects. That are typically allocated to people that may not have the same educational and economic resources, because historically those people have not had access to certain things. Even the whole, like, the more I've been reading, and again, I don't pretend to be an expert on any of this. Like, I'm educating myself daily, as everybody should, right? But I had no idea how much things like, even like the GI Bill, right, for people coming back from World War II, and how that helped folks set up some economic stability that's trickled down to generations where some folks didn't have access to that, right? You talk about other people who've inherited lump sums of money because they have certain, ties to bigger families, bigger estates, whatever. if you don't have that sort of head start and you're not in a system that's set up to benefit you initially, then the system doesn't work for you. And that's systemic, whatever you want to call it, whether it's racism, whether it's gender bias, whether it's whatever, that's part of the system, you know. There's too many examples to even begin to name. You know, I mean, we've seen nonstop examples all throughout this year. There's numerous examples every single year that can be pointed out. But I mean, it's because the system was not created to represent everyone. And we're still living by that system, you know, so
it's definitely broken.
Yeah.
Yeah, and unfortunate that in 2020, right, we're still dealing with it. When it's quite frankly, to some extent, really in conflict with what's in the Constitution, the very principles upon which we were founded.
Absolutely.
Dela, AJ, thoughts from either of you on this topic?
Yeah, I think, you know, for me, systemic racism, aside from the endless number of reasons why it exists and why it's wrong and why something needs to be done, I think something that hits home for me is that racism is a public health issue. Racism is a healthcare issue. And I, you know, as a physician, as someone with a public health degree, as someone in preventive medicine, as someone who just overall has had the luxury of time and education and research devoted to healthcare disparities, none of this was a new concept for me. I feel like it's been an awakening in a lot of my colleagues who have expressed just now coming to understand that there are healthcare disparities that are fundamentally impacting not only the way we provide healthcare, but how it's received. And that's everything from, you know, the research that's come out the latest about the only children that have, for the most part, the only children who have been dying from COVID-19 have been Black and brown children. The only, you know, there were testing issues, there were access issues, there were treatment issues, that's just with COVID. But I've been studying surgical outcome differences. So people come in for gunshot wounds and stabs, and for decades, physicians, providers, we've always thought that we're the one place that's not biased, right? If you come to me, whether you're Black, white, president, or whomever, and you are injured and you come into the emergency room, I am supposed to give you the same exact care. I'm the same doctor on call. I have the same nurses, the same tools, instruments, etc. But what research has actually proven is that the outcomes are not the same. And between race and insurance status, those two factors alone impact outcomes in the 20, 30, 40% difference range. And it's just not acceptable. And the fact that so many of my colleagues were unaware that healthcare disparities existed really, really has been hard for me to grasp. And I'm trying to figure out how to help overcome that. But I think it's our responsibility to break that and be a part of that change. And each of us to at least empower ourselves in our fields and our specialties, because we're supposed to be biased for the rest of you. We're supposed to be where you feel safe and where vulnerability comes to play, and people come with, you know, in their most vulnerable state. And if we are also exhibiting bias and racism, and there's something systemically that really needs to change in healthcare. And I think people get stuck sometimes in the conversation at the insurance level, and they think that insurance is for the poor and they fight it, and they don't think of universal healthcare as a right. But I think when you really look at and you grasp how sort of all-encompassing this problem is in healthcare, let alone in every other aspect of life, I think it's really powerful and can be really important to start wheeling change.
Thank you. AJ, comments?
Yeah, I mean, I think that this, you know, I think Thavius and Dela touched on really extremely important points. And I think it just goes and is rooted a lot deeper than what I think people even realize. A lot of this goes back to slavery, right? Where you have women that you can tell me, I don't know the actual percentage, but Black women die at extremely higher rates than any other ethnicity giving birth or just in the hospital, right? And when you talk about George Floyd and how this has been the catalyst, right? Where you see a lot of these protests, and yet you still see people trying to make excuses as to why it is that there's something he had to have done. And I feel as if a lot of this dates back to where in slavery, where Black Americans, okay, Black people were deemed inferior, less than even human, right? We were not susceptible to pain. We felt pain differently. Our heads were big. All these different factors of us that made us seem as if we were less than even dogs, right? That is something that is still a part of this system that has risen up into the healthcare, that's risen up into just everyday life and everyday society. And that is where these stereotypes initially come from. And then you have even just where you have systemic racism, where you have people discriminating against the color of your skin. And a lot of that, again, I remember one segment, I think it was MSNBC did it, and it was on YouTube, where they had, it's old, but they have these young kids, different races, and they're asked to pick the pretty doll and the ugly doll, right? And every single one of them chose the Black doll as the ugly doll. Even the young Black children picked this Black doll as what was the ugly doll, right? That is how deep this is put in, that even Black people see themselves as threats at times. Even Black people don't see themselves as beautiful or don't see themselves as worthy, because it is something that has been put in place since the beginning of time to make us not just Black people feel that way, and of course, white people believe it, right? And make everyone afraid of dark skin, where there should be no fear at all. But these are all things that have been put in place on purpose, right, to enable and to make sure that people of color stay inferior, stay below. And I mean, I think one of the most recent examples could even be Serena Williams, where she had to ask for a service. She could have died from that blood clot after giving birth because the nurse was not showing her the adequate care that was necessary and was not believing the pain that she was in. And if she had not asked for I don't know what she asked for, but she had not asked for it herself, I don't know if Serena Williams would even be alive today. And these are just blatant examples of how it is that regardless of what's taking place, if your skin is darker due to the fact that these systems have been systematic systems have been put in place for a purpose a really long time ago. And it's more than just making money. It is truly to make not just white people hate Black people, but make Black people hate Black people. If you can keep that, you can keep them low, you can keep them down, and truly make them feel that they are inferior, just as some white people in America view them as well.
And I think to that point, too, that really goes to oppression. But if you can take a segment of society and make them start to doubt themselves and not feel like they're worth it, are they going to push back on that, or are they just going to be resigned to that? And to me, that's sort of that systemic oppression of trying to keep people down. To some extent, if you can get it that deeply ingrained into that segment, where, they're doing the same thing. To your example, even Black girls picking the Black doll. Then you start to really create a psyche that starts to believe that as well.
America of the fierce urgency of now. This is no time to engage in the luxury of cooling off or to take the tranquilizing drug of gradualism.